This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt stuck, whether it's a major life transition, a dark night of the soul, or just staying small out of fear. If you've ever struggled to move forward, if you're repeating unhealthy patterns in relationships, or you have a black belt in beating yourself up, you were meant for more, and this podcast is for you. We'll get real, we'll get vulnerable, we'll probably cuss a little bit, and we'll get to the root of it all, your self-worth. With every step, you'll find the courage to rise. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Courage to Rise podcast. For those of you who know me and follow my blog, you know that writing is my medium of choice, and a podcast was actually never on my roadmap. However, I got so many signs and nudges from the universe that I'm supposed to do a podcast that I'm doing a podcast before it decides to drop a giant microphone on my head. Message received. Here's the first episode of my podcast. In this first episode, I want to tell you about my journey, about how I came to be a coach, about how my blog came to be, about how this podcast came to be, and why I chose the name Courage to Rise. One of the biggest things I've learned in my journey is that we often go through life thinking that everybody else has it together and that we're the only ones who feel broken, because we're not actually broken, but who feel broken or who feel like we don't have our lives together. And I operated from that place for a long time. I thought everybody else had everything figured out, and I was the only one who didn't. And it made me very hesitant to share any of the struggles that I was going through because I thought it was a weakness. I thought people would look down on me. Everybody looked at me like I had my life together, and I felt a lot of shame around it. Because my story is I've been married and divorced twice. I've been in and out of major debt twice. I briefly struggled with an eating disorder. I've been through anxiety. I've been through depression. I've been in a heap on the floor with my life collapsed around me more than once. Each time it happened, it got a little bit louder and a little bit worse until there was one night in 2016 where I came very close to checking myself out of this life. And that's not an easy thing to talk about, but it's an important thing to talk about because, as I said, a lot of people that look at me from the outside would have never guessed that I was struggling with so much inside, that I had such a battle going on internally. And the reason that I chose the name Courage to Rise for my company, for my blog, for my program, for everything, is because it takes courage to be in this human experience. It takes courage to live this life. It takes courage to pick yourself up after life has knocked you on your ass, whether it's divorce, whether it's a career transition, whether it's a bad breakup, whatever it is that happens, it takes courage to stand up from that. And not just that, but it takes courage to look at your life, even if there's not a major transition going on. It takes courage to look at your life and go, I'm not happy with how things are. I don't want to continue living this way. I'm willing to take a look at myself. I'm willing to look at what's standing in my way, whether it's me, whether it's some belief I have, whatever it is. I'm willing to look at it, and I'm willing to take the steps forward. I'm willing to grow because it's not easy. It's not an easy journey to look deep within ourselves, to look at the things that have happened in our life, the things that we've been through, and ask ourselves, how did I get there? And so many people repeat patterns. And it's one of the things that I do with clients, because it's one of the things I had to do with myself, is look at what are the patterns that you're repeating? Because we keep repeating the same patterns until we take the time to stop and look at them. And for me, I was repeating the same pattern of chronic unworthiness, first of all. And I say pattern because I wasn't healing what was underneath it, which was that I ultimately didn't value myself. I didn't feel like I was worthy at all. And so that led me to make a lot of decisions and take a lot of actions and just do a lot of things that weren't in my best interest. And so it took a lot to stop and look at that. And I had to learn those lessons the hard way. And I joke about it, but it's true. I told my mother once when I was a teenager, she asked me, she said, why do you have to learn everything the hard way? And I shouted back at her in all of my teenage angst, what other way is there to learn? Guys, let me tell you, there are lots of other ways to learn. And I got tired of learning things the hard way. I got tired of getting knocked on my ass, and I hit such a dark point where I had no choice but to figure out how to move forward, how to heal, how to stop repeating those patterns in my life so that I could have a better quality of life, so that I could have fulfillment, so I could have a fulfilling career, so I could have a fulfilling relationship, so I could just be happy in my life no matter what. And when I say happy, I truly mean happy and content. There's this misconception sometimes that to be happy means either everything has to be perfect or that it has to be that way all the time. And that's not a true aspect of the human experience. The human experience is a tapestry of emotions. It's a tapestry of ups and downs, in the same way that you appreciate spring more after winter and that every season has something special about it. The same seasons that we go through in life, it's the same thing. If we were just, 100% everything was perfect all the time, well, first of all, that's not reality, and we'll talk about perfect being bullshit another time. But when I say happy, I mean content within myself. And I mean that pain in the human experience is inevitable. We're going to feel pain. We're going to feel loss. There are just things that are part of this human experience that are painful. We're going to feel pain. But the suffering that we go through, the suffering that we keep ourselves in, the ways that we keep ourselves stuck, that's the part that's optional. That's the part that we can work through, that we can heal, where we don't have to experience so much suffering. We don't have to stay stuck in these places. We can move through the pain in a healthy way, but we don't get trapped in suffering. And I tell my clients this all the time, and it was something I had to learn. We don't ever arrive as the Buddha on the mountaintop where nothing ever throws us off, nothing ever flusters us, unless you want to go live in a monastery by yourself on a mountaintop. And by all means, that's your choice. But as long as we're going to be living in this world, there are going to be things that trigger us, that impact us, that we have to deal with. But the key is there are easier ways, there are better ways to work through those things. And that's ultimately the work that I did on myself, and the work that I do with clients is getting to that point where it doesn't have to be so hard, where you don't have to suffer so much. Okay, enough lead up. I'll get to the juicy stuff and I'll tell you my story. Where I want to start is I want to start with when I was in my 20s. And there's a lot that I can talk about. There's a lot I can say about my story. How do you sum up almost 40 years on the planet, right? But I want to start with the first time that my life really fell apart. The first time that it took a dramatic departure from what I thought it was going to be. So for those of you ladies out there who are currently in your 20s, or those who have at some point been in your 20s, there is a societal pressure around getting married, around having kids. There are all these societal scripts that we play out, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that in future episodes. But when I was in my 20s, I was very much buying into this pressure that I had to get married, that I had to find a partner, that was the next thing on the list to define me. And I had a really rocky road with relationships up until that point. It's, relationships are what have taught me my greatest lessons in life. They are the vehicle that I have learned everything through. We all have sort of the different paths that we tread, and relationships bring up our shit in general, but for me, they've always been very intense. And I'll talk later about, some of the toxic relationships that I ended up in. But everything I've learned has largely come through the lens of relationship. And in my 20s, I wanted so badly to move on to the next thing. I wanted to check the box. I wanted to get married. I wanted to have the house, all these things. And I was really intent on having those things. And I was buying into a lot of the pressure around me at the time that, at 25, I needed to be married or to be engaged. And it was really an extension of me not understanding, I've mentioned that self-worth is one of the biggest lessons that I learned here, and that I was looking to put my worth and my validation externally, and being married would define me, right? It put me in a place, and I didn't really understand. I don't know that anybody really understands, especially in your 20s, what really goes into a marriage and what really goes into a relationship. And for me, he was a nice guy. He was from a nice family. We got along, and that was enough for me at that point. And I confess, I pushed him. I did all the stereotypical things that women do, and his family pushed him too. And I don't know, to be honest, that it was something he really wanted to do either. I can't speak for him, certainly, or his experience, but I think he also felt a lot of the pressure to sort of be defined by being married. And so we got engaged and we got married. And I had that picture perfect wedding that I'd been dreaming about since I could put a towel on my head and walk around as a bride. I was doing what I thought I was supposed to be doing at that point, and I didn't connect that there was an undercurrent of sadness about it. I don't remember this, but my mother tells me that I cried the night before I got married. I do remember crying on our honeymoon in secret, and I remember feeling things that I didn't understand how to process because I should, right? We should on ourselves so much, tell ourselves how we should feel and what we should do, but that I felt like I should be happy, and I just wasn't. I didn't have the awareness at the time of what was going on, and my answer to everything in life was run a little bit harder, run a little bit faster, never stop long enough to feel anything. And I started pushing him to have a baby. And here's the thing, I've kind of always known I didn't want to have my own children, but I was feeling so lost and so confused that the thing that made the most sense to me at the time was, okay, well, how can I continue to fit into the mold? Like, how can I continue to follow the path that I'm quote unquote supposed to be on? And thankfully he had the presence of mind to know that we had no business doing that together, and bless him for that. I'm so grateful for that. But it started showing up in other ways for me. My unhappiness, my dissatisfaction. I was so far out of alignment with myself. I gained a lot of weight. I, had some unhealthy eating patterns. I would binge eat. I would make a whole batch of cookies and eat them all, eat all the dough. Like, I would make myself sick. I would overspend. I can't tell you how many clothes that I gave away years later with the tags still on them, because I was desperate I was trying to fill a void within me that I had no other idea how to fill. Keep in mind, this is all within the very first year of our marriage together. And at the time, I didn't connect this, but after we did get divorced, when I looked back on it, and especially now at this point in my life, when I look back on it, my intuition was on the entire time. I knew that we really didn't have any business getting married, but I didn't know how to listen to that, and I just stuffed it down, and I was doing what I thought I should do. And so in our first year of marriage, I feel for him, because I must have been a miserable person to be married to as well, because I was just unhappy. And one of the things that was a big struggle for me is that he's a good guy. He was intelligent, he was kind, he was hardworking. There was nothing that I could point to if he had been abusive or, anything that I could have pointed to have a quote unquote reason to leave. I think it would have made more sense to me, but that was one of the things that I struggled with was, but he's a nice guy, and there must just be something wrong with me that I'm so unhappy right now. We did go to counseling at some point toward the end, and I remember that it was probably about a month that I had been dancing around this idea of divorce. And it was such a foreign thing for me, because in our family and in his family, everyone had been married for 30, 40, plus years. And we had all these success stories and all these role models. And somewhere in the course of our conversations, he admitted to me that he hadn't felt it either. And that he just figured in time, basically, we would just fall into the same place that everyone else was, and it would just be okay. And when I heard from him that he had known too, that really we didn't have any business together, that was the point where I told him, I think I want a divorce. And, it was an especially hard thing because he was a good guy and he was from a good family. And like I said, there wasn't anything I could point to that was bad about it. It's just, we just never should have gotten married. And when I look back and I think about even the weeks leading up to our wedding, I knew it wasn't right. but I had no idea how to call off a wedding. And nobody tells you what's cold feet and what's don't marry this person. And so I have so much respect for women or for men who realize before the wedding that it's not the right thing and that they call off a wedding, because it's a big thing to call off a wedding. And I didn't have the strength, the presence of mind at that point. I didn't have the ability to do that because, again, this is where it ties back to that self-worth. I had so much uncertainty within me, and I distrusted myself so much, and I trusted everybody else above myself. And I didn't have the strength at that point to say, I know this isn't right. It's going to inconvenience some people. It's going to make some people unhappy. It's going to hurt him, but it's going to be less hurt and less pain and less whatever than if I wait and if I go ahead with this when I know deep down that it's not right. And so that was one of the big lessons that I took away from this, was that your intuition is always right. And when I say I wasn't happy in that marriage, I'm not talking about he left the toilet seat up and it was annoying. I'm talking about on a deep fundamental level, I was unhappy. And the real reason I was unhappy that I didn't understand at the time is that I was going so far against what I knew was right for me, and I was stuffing it down and I wasn't listening to it. And when we finally made the decision to get divorced, it was very amicable. We sat in the middle of our kitchen at midnight. I baked cookies while he had a yellow legal pad, and we divided up our belongings. When you're married just over a year, and you're in your 20s, you really don't have much to divide up. It was, I said, take the house, I want the dog. We divided everything up, and it was very amicable at that point. And I found an apartment and I moved out, and divorce is a singularly unique experience. It is a singularly painful experience, even when it's the right thing to do. And there's no question in my mind that it was the right thing for us not to stay married, because we could have stayed married. Neither one of us would have been happy, and we both deserved the opportunity to find real happiness and to find real love. And people ask me, do you guys still talk? We don't talk, but we don't not talk. We don't have a reason to talk. He's gone on with his life. I've gone on with mine. He's married with kids, and I assume very happy. And I'm, my life has been a roller coaster, but I wouldn't change it. It was the right decision to make. But my point in that is that for me, especially, it was both a freedom and a release, because I was finally listening to my intuition and I was finally following what was right. And it was a complete disruption of the path I thought my life was going to take. And so it was this bizarre mix of being a high in the sense that I had been living in so much angst and anxiety and depression and suppression for all that time, because I had known on some level that I didn't want to be in that marriage. And so there was that freedom that was associated with it, but there was also a massive amount of pain. I was the first person in my friend group, in my family, in his family, and anybody I knew, really, to get divorced. And at that young of an age, it really wasn't something that I wanted to be a leader on, to be on the forefront of. But I was, and I was looking at how do you put your life back together again? And like I said, it's a singularly painful and unique experience. And if you have not gone through a divorce, you really don't understand. And it is very different than a breakup. And there are stages and things that you go through. I remember I would cry for no reason, and that had never happened to me before. I'd always been an emotional person. I'd cried, but it would come on completely out of the blue. I remember going to get a coffee one morning, and the barista that I saw all the time, and she said, "Good morning, Jen. How are you?" And I said, "Good morning, Kate. I'm getting divorced," and started crying. And I think she gave me my coffee for free that day, bless her heart. But it was very destabilizing, because at 26 years old, my life was supposed to be following a path. I was going to be married. I was going to, have this defined path. And all of a sudden, nothing made sense anymore. Everything was completely uncertain. And for anybody that's gone through divorce, this is part of the process. It's such a dramatic departure from what you thought your life was going to be. And all of a sudden, one thing that was there that was meant to be there for the rest of your life is gone. Again, even if it's for a good reason, even if it's for the right reason, it's still very destabilizing. And it's a process that you go through. And I will talk a lot more about that moving forward. But there was a couple months, maybe 2 months after we filed, and I had been living on my own, and there were some things happening with my job and just a lot of things going on, where I had a night where I was literally in a puddle, in a heap on the floor, crying, bawling, because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I was going to do. I knew that it wasn't right to stay in the marriage. I didn't regret getting out of it, but I also didn't know what the hell was going to happen with the rest of my life, because nothing made sense anymore. And I didn't know how to put those pieces back together again. I ended up moving to a new state, taking a new job, and throwing myself into a new relationship. And I alluded earlier to the fact that I've always been very intense in relationships, and that was something that I've taken a lot of time and work to heal in the last couple of years. And yes, it took me that long to figure it out, but I hurled myself headlong into another relationship because, again, that was just how I operated at that point. I was running hard, running fast, move. And I didn't want to take the time to really be unhappy and fully process the divorce and just everything that was going on with my life. And so I threw myself whole hog into this new relationship. And, I'm always very careful when I talk about my relationships because there are two people involved in those things, right? And the men that were involved in my life, they were on their own journey too. They were on their own path. Everybody has their own stuff to deal with. And all I can do is own my part in it, because that's the part that I fully own and fully have responsibility for. And the relationship that I put myself into, it ended up turning very toxic after a while. He got very verbally abusive, and I didn't, because I didn't value myself and I didn't really have any self-worth when it came to relationships. I just took it and I just let it get worse and worse and worse. And we finally broke up, and I was devastated, and it was a failure. I felt like I had failed in marriage because I had a lot that I was processing around this idea that no one in my family had been divorced, that there was a lot I was dealing with about the fact that I had gotten married and then gotten divorced. So there's a lot I was processing around that. And then this relationship that I had, in a very unhealthy way, thrown myself into had then fallen apart. And so I was really pretty delayed in processing the divorce and getting back on my feet, because I had just thrown a Band-Aid over it and thrown myself into this new relationship. And it's not uncommon. It's why people talk about rebounds after divorce and things like that. And the biggest thing you can do is take time for yourself to heal, because trust me, you ain't going to be any good to anybody else right away after a marriage falls apart or a relationship falls apart. Take a couple months, take more than a couple months, figure out who you are again. But so that was finally the point where I did that. And I put a lot of time and energy into figuring out who I was. And this time for the first time, because it was after the divorce, and I was looking at, wow, I didn't really own my intuition around that. I didn't own the things and trust the things that I knew going into it. And it ended up being a really beautiful time in my life, because I was in my late 20s. I was right around my 30th birthday. I was in the best shape of my life. I had gotten out of debt. I'd worked really hard to get out of debt, and I was in a really good place. And my quote at that time, and I still use this today, was own your shit. Like, whatever you're feeling, whatever feels right for you, just own it. And so I had the beginnings of, kind of the breakthroughs and where I am today, but there were a lot of other things that I had to go through to get here. And so from that place, again, like I said, my life was in a good place. It was probably 2 years after we'd gotten divorced, maybe 2.5 years. And, I had been dating, and I was just loving my life. I was involved in a running club, and my life was just full. And I was really happy, and I was really just loving my life. And I ended up meeting a man through mutual friends who I would end up getting married to many years later. And I went into that relationship from a very different place. I was very grounded at that point in who I was. I had boundaries before I really even realized what they were. I was in a really good place. And I, especially having come off of a divorce and knowing how hard and horrible and awful it is, there's some quote, I wish I could remember who said this, that said, getting divorced is like getting in a really bad car accident every day of your life for a year. And yeah, that's true. So I knew that I wanted to be very careful. I knew I wanted to be married again to the right person. And I wanted to be very careful about how I made that choice. And I married my second husband. I loved him very much. We had a good relationship. There were things I didn't realize at the time that he struggled with, that I just simply had no experience with. And again, this is my story, not his story. But about less than a year into our marriage, I would actually say several months into our marriage, things started to be really volatile. And we would go from having just a calm conversation to all of a sudden there was shouting, there was screaming. It got really volatile. And there were several incidents that occurred in rapid succession, one of which ended up with a SWAT team showing up at my house, which is just not what I would wish on anybody. It was an incredibly traumatic experience, and I didn't even realize how traumatic it was at the time. But basically, that event led me to uncover the fact that he was a very high-functioning alcoholic. And eventually, our marriage got to the point where it was no longer safe for me to stay. And so I had to leave and get divorced a second time. And it was hard for me in different ways because I did love him. I had been very careful about getting married again. And it was painful in new ways because while, I have a lot of admiration for my first husband, he's a good man, I was never in love with him. I never loved him. I loved him in the way that you care about a friend, that you care about someone, but we were never in love. And I did love my second husband, and it was hard because the choice was made for me. I had to choose to stay in a very unsafe situation or choose to take myself out of it. And it was hard. It was really hard. And coming off of having been married once, having gone through a divorce, having put my life back together again, having found someone that I really loved, and he treated me very well up until the point where things got very unsafe and the alcohol took over. And it was different for me because while I've alluded again to the fact that, I'd been in a toxic relationship. I had some patterns of choosing men who I allowed to treat me a certain way, but somehow it was different when it was a threat to my physical safety. And I had no choice but to remove myself from that situation. But coming off of that, it almost threw me backwards it's like almost like I regressed in some ways on my growth because, again, I've said divorce is really destabilizing. And especially for me, I'd been through it once. And here I am going through it again. And so I'm telling myself all these stories about how I fail at marriage, I fail at relationships. And then if you've ever been in a situation like that where you've had someone who you're married to or who in your relationship with who has not been truthful with you, and he hid a lot from me for a long time, and it really made me question myself on a number of levels. And so it was not only destabilizing from the divorce aspect, but it was extremely destabilizing in my trust in myself. And I moved into this shitty little apartment after that because we were living in the Bay Area. And even though I was making really good money, if you live in the Bay Area, you know how it goes and what the housing situation is there. But I moved into this really depressing little apartment because I had to get out, and I had to get out fast. And my entire life was just in shambles, and I had no idea how to put it back together again, and even where to start at that point. And I remember I saw a counselor not long after that incident happened, and I kind of recounted to her what had happened, and she said, that was traumatic. And I said, no, I'm fine. I'm totally fine. Because remember, that's how I cope with things, right? I deny them. I stuff them down. I run harder, run faster. I said, no, that's fine. I'm fine. I'm tough. I can deal with it. And she made me sit there and say, no, that was traumatic. Because there was a firearm involved. And again, I had an entire SWAT team at my house. But I was dealing with a lot of things, a lot of trauma after that. And when I tell you that I hurled myself into my next relationship, I thought I had the first time, but this time it was even worse because I was so tired of being in pain. I was so tired of I just couldn't believe that this was where my life was, right? That I had been married and divorced now twice, and the second time to a man I really loved. You know, the first time that I got divorced, what was hard about that was the divorce itself, was that it was a departure from everything I'd known, everything I thought my life was going to be. And even though I never missed my first husband, it was the trauma around the divorce itself, around just the complete shift in your life. And then the second time, it was because I really did love him, and it was hard in brand new ways. And it was after that, it was that summer, that for the first time in my life, I mean, you can argue that I had disordered eating at various points, that I would eat my feelings. I know a lot of you know what I'm talking about when I say that. But right after our divorce, I started a pattern of binging and purging. And I at least had the awareness of what was going on. And I remember I told my mom about it one night, and bless her heart, I'm sure just as a mother, she died a little bit inside, but trust me, I've done way worse. I've done way worse to her. I'm going to write a book someday called Phone Calls I've Made to My Mom, because I actually called her the night that the cops were at the house, and I called her and I said, because they were living in Colorado, and I said, I just need to tell you something. Everybody's okay, but I need to share some things. And just then there was a knock at the door, and I said, hold on, the cops are still here. And I'm hanging up the phone and hearing my mom like screaming on the other end. God bless her. I'm sorry for the gray hairs, Mom. I love you. But anyway, I digress. So I dealt with an eating disorder, and it was a byproduct of how much pain I was in and really, truly not understanding what to do next, like how to deal with it. And I did. I threw myself into my next relationship, and I threw myself into it from a place of literal trauma. I had been living in a really high anxiety state for a long time because of the situation that was going on in my house with my ex-husband. And I threw myself into this situation, and it was a case of I wanted my knight in shining armor. And I didn't know how to stop and do the work on things. I didn't know really where to go, what to do with it. And so I threw myself into this other relationship, and it ended up being the biggest lesson of my life over the course of several years. Some of the most traumatic things that I've dealt with, and the relationship that ultimately showed me how much I didn't value myself, because there were things I put up with, ways that I showed up in that relationship that really crystallized for me that I didn't put a lot of value on myself, that I didn't understand my own worth. And it took me getting to a point where I was literally so broken down, and I'm talking, it was trauma on top of trauma. It was PTSD. It was nervous system stuff. It was living in a constant state of anxiety. It was every bit of unworthiness, every bit of insecurity. I mean, just take it all from my entire life, just packaged all together in this crescendo of shit. And I didn't even recognize myself anymore. And that's the point where it was December 2016, and I was in so much pain. And it was just and again, you wouldn't have known it looking on the outside. I'm sure there are people that know me that are listening to this that probably had absolutely no idea this was going on. But I was in so much pain, and I was so lost. And there were just so many things that I didn't understand about everything that I had been through, everything that had happened to me. And I remember I was in the middle of the floor, and I was thinking it would just be so much easier not to be here anymore. It would be so much easier not to be here anymore, because I just didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know what to do next. And I remember this voice that said, hey, if you're going to check yourself out, really, is that the way we're going to do it? Because if you've decided that you don't want to do this anymore, let's just pick up and move to a desert island and just completely go off the grid. And y'all, that may sound bizarre, but that's what happened. And I thought, well, okay. And I sat up and I breathed for the first time. And it was from that point where I had been so close to really taking myself out, to really not wanting to be here anymore, where I thought, let me just figure out how I got here, and let me figure out how in the world I let my life get to this point where at 37 years old, I'm in a toxic, emotionally, verbally abusive relationship, how I've been married and divorced twice, how I've been through all these things, how I've been in and out of debt. Let me just figure it out. Let me figure out how I got here. And it was that point where I sat up and said, I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to figure this out. And that's the point where I wrote a blog post about this, where you make a soul decision. And when I say soul decision, I mean deep from within you. You make this decision that your things are going to be different, that you're going to figure it out, that you're going to have the life you want no matter what it takes. And that's what I mean when I say courage to rise. And that's what resonated with me when I was thinking about what I wanted to name my company, what I wanted to name my coaching company, what I wanted to name my program. Is it takes courage from that place to say, from that broken fucking place on the bottom of the floor in the dark night of the soul, the deepest, darkest, gnarliest, nastiest night, where you literally have no idea how you're going to pick yourself up, but you have the courage to say, I'm going to do it. I don't know how, but I'm going to figure it out. And take whatever steps you have to take to come out of that. And it's not an easy path, right? There's no quick fix. I didn't wake up the next morning with this clear roadmap where, the clouds parted and the angels sang the Hallelujah chorus or whatever. And somebody handed me this scroll that said, hey, here's the steps you take to, step into the life that you really want to live. I would love if it happened that way, but that's on the long list of things that I wish that aren't a thing. But I made the decision that things were going to be different for me, that I was going to figure out my money situation, that I was going to figure out why relationships had always been so hard for me, that I was going to figure out how I had gotten to the place where I was, where inside I felt so broken and so lost and so disconnected from myself, that no matter what it took, I was going to find every resource, find every coach, find every path that I could to just figure it out, because I knew there had to be a better way. And so that's the highlight of my story that led me to where I am. And I have had to put my life back together several times. And I remember telling my best friend at one point, why do I have to keep doing this? Like, why do I have to keep doing this? What am I doing wrong that I'm not learning? And she kind of laughed and she said, well, it's for a reason. And I understand now that a big reason why I went through that is that I'm just a human guinea pig, guys. What can I say? But I went through it because as part of my purpose is to take those lessons, because I've lived it and I've been there, and I'm not just giving it lip service. I've literally been in the heap on the floor. I've had my life burned down and rebuilt multiple times, and I've learned the lessons the hard way. And there is a much, much better way to do this. And that's part of what my work is. And that's part of why I'm passionate about what I do. That's why I wanted to do this podcast and share my story and share so vulnerably about everything that I've gone through, because I want other people to know that they're not alone, and the things that they experience they happen, and they happen to a lot of us, and that it's a safe space. It's one of the things I tell my clients on our first call, is that this is a safe space. I have no judgment for anything that you've been through, anything that you're going through, because, hey, I've made all the mistakes, and most of them I've made more than once. And that's what I had to do to learn from it. But it's a judgment-free zone, because anytime you're ready to take a look at things, anytime you're ready to take a look at what you've been through, and you're ready to take a hard look at it and deal with the things that come up around it, because, we can let shame block us. We can let shame block us in not talking about the things that we've gone through and not looking at them, because it is so hard. And I think for me, that was a part of it too, is I didn't always want to look at the things I'd been through because I had this idea in my head that I was quote unquote supposed to. There's that shoulding and supposed to, right? I was supposed to have this perfect life, and I was supposed to be this, perfect leader and perfect human and perfect whatever. I don't know, insert your favorite word here. And I had shame around the fact that I'd been married and divorced. And ironically, I was more willing to talk about that than I was willing to talk about the fact that I'd been in and out of major debt twice in my life. And that's part of what I tell my clients is this is a safe space, because all of us need the safe space to process through these things without shame and without judgment. And remember, everybody is human. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We all go through hard things. We all go through ups and downs. It's not an excuse to continue to do it. It's just a compassionate acceptance of the fact that we're human and we're going to make mistakes. And the best thing we can do is look at them from a place of compassion, from a place of curiosity, and go, I wonder why I did that. Let me sit with that so that I learn what I need to learn from it, so that I don't do it again. That's the way that we heal and that we move through things. And that's ultimately what I ended up doing, was looking back and going, how did I get here? Without any shame and without any judgment. Because anytime we bring shame to the game, rhymed like that. Anytime we bring shame to the game, we're blocking ourselves from healing. We're blocking ourselves from really looking at it. And so when we can look at things that have happened to us, things that we've been through, things that we've done, things that maybe we're not proud of, and go, wonder why I did that. Let's get curious about it. Let me see what information is there. And you treat it like you're a detective, because then you put an inch of space in there and it's not so personal. And you look at what's going on with me that I would take those actions, that I would do that. And you start to get really curious about it. And that's where the information is. And that's how we start on this healing path. Because that was one of the big lessons that I learned, is I just wanted to run harder and faster and not feel anything, not deal with anything, not look at anything, because I had dealt with enough pain and I didn't want to bring any of it up. And, I was superhuman and nothing bothered me, and I was just strong and I could deal with it. And I was emotionally strong and I could deal with it. And yeah, being strong is a good thing, but I was also completely bypassing the fact that I had a lot of pain and things that I was dealing with. And the more that you bypass pain, the more you ignore it, it's not going away. It's going to come out in other ways. And those were the two things for me, is I didn't understand my own value. I didn't understand my own worth. I'd always been very, very hard on myself, just horrible to myself. And it was the unworthiness, and then it was the avoidance and the lack of an understanding of how to deal with the pain. And so I would just run harder, push back, run harder, faster, whatever to get away from it. And those were the big lessons of just stopping and sitting with it and going, hey, what's really behind this? What's really going on here? What do I really need to learn from this so that I don't keep repeating these patterns? That's the first step in rising from anything, is accepting your starting point, accepting where you are, not judging it, not bringing shame to it, not shoulding all over yourself, just accepting your starting point, looking at the ways that either unworthiness or pain or suppression of something is showing up in your life. It usually shows up in overdoing something, right? Overspending, overeating, overdrinking. And, that was something that happened to me too, is I had never been a big drinker. College doesn't count. Nobody tells stories about college. Anyway, college doesn't count. I'd never been a big drinker. I drank socially, but after my second marriage, I ironically was the one that started drinking more, because it was just a way to numb anxiety. It was a way to not feel things. And I started drinking more, and it got to a point where it was really interfering with the quality of my life, because I came to define a drinking problem as anything that interfered with quality of life. And Lord knows I had enough experience with it. And so I made the decision to stop drinking for a while, because it was a way that I was numbing and avoiding things that I really needed to feel and look at. And so those are the things that we want to take a look at, because that's where information comes up. Is, maybe you have patterns of shopping, of retail therapy, or maybe you have a couple too many glasses of wine on a pretty regular basis. It's not that there's anything wrong with wine. I'm not a teetotaler. I don't believe that wine is evil. I believe that anything we're using to numb or to bypass or to avoid our feelings is something we need to stop doing for a while and take a look at things. Same thing with alcohol, and I'll do some podcasts on this going forward, but those are the ways that those are the evidence, right? The symptoms that something might be out of alignment with us and that we need to take a look at it. And again, it starts with really taking a compassionate look at ourselves, at what's going on. And so I wanted to share my story with you. And I'm going to go work off a vulnerability hangover in a little bit, because guess what, guys? It's not easy getting up here and talking about this and putting this online, but it needs to happen. And the reason that I wanted to share my story is there are a lot of important lessons, and there are a lot of things that we kind of keep in the closet, and we feel like it only happens to us. And like I said, that everybody else has their stuff together and we're the only ones that don't. And it's not true. Everybody has stuff that they deal with. Everybody has challenges that they go through. It's about learning how to work through these things in a really healthy way. It's about finding the tools to do it, finding the right support to do it. And so that's what this podcast is going to be about. That's what my blog is about, is sharing the lessons I've learned in my life, sharing the tools and the things that I've learned through my coaching training and just through my general curiosity about how to live a better life and how to work through this human experience in the best way. And so that's what you can look forward to in coming episodes. And not all of them will be as heavy as this one, I guarantee you that. But thank you guys so much for tuning in, for listening. I hope that something about this really resonated with you, and I look forward to talking with you guys in future episodes. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Courage to Rise podcast. Visit my website, couragetorise.com, for more information on one-on-one coaching, group coaching programs, and other upcoming events. Remember, life's too short not to sparkle. Sparkle on.